Have you had a nice night, my sweet blood bag? It's time for me to put you to bed. You're being a little greedy. I guess I can read you a story, 2 or 3. But where should we begin? It is October after all. I know. Lay back, take a deep breath, and listen to the tale of Fitchers Bird. There was once a wizard who used to take the form of a poor man. He went to the houses and begged and caught pretty girls. No one knew whither he carried them, for they were never seen more. One day he appeared before the door of a man who had 3 pretty daughters. He looked like a poor weak beggar and carried a basket on his back, as if he meant to collect charitable gifts in it. He begged for a little food, and when the eldest daughter came out and was just reaching him a piece of bread, he did but touch her, and she was forced to jump into his basket. Thereupon he hurried away with long strides and carried her away into a dark forest to his house, which stood in the midst of it. Everything in the house was magnificent. He gave her whatsoever she could possibly desire, and said, "My darling, thou wilt certainly be happy with me, for thou hast everything thy heart can wish for." This lasted for a few days, and then he said, "I must journey forth and leave thee alone for a short time. There are keys of the house. Thou may goes to wherever and anywhere and look at everything except into one room, which this little key here opens. And there I forbid thee to go on pain of death." He likewise gave her an egg and said, "Preserve the egg carefully for me, and carry it continually about with thee, for a great misfortune would arise from the loss of it." She took the keys and the egg and promised to obey him in everything. When he was gone, she went all around the house from the bottom to the top and examined everything. The room shone with silver and gold, and she thought she had never seen such great splendor. At length she came to the forbidden door. She wished to pass it by, but curiosity let her have no rest. She examined the key, and it looked just like any other. She put it in the hole and turned it a little, and the door sprang open. But what did she see when she went in? A great bloody basin stood in the middle of the room, and therein lay human beings, dead and hewn into pieces. And hard by was a block of wood, and a gleaming axe lay upon it. She was so terribly alarmed that the egg which she held in her hand fell into the basin. She got it out and washed off, but in vain. It appeared again, and in a moment she washed and she scrubbed, but it could not get out. As not long before the man came back from his journey, and the first things which he asked for were the key and the egg. She gave it to him, but she trembled as she did so, and he saw at once by the red spots that she had been in the bloody chamber. "Since thou hast gone into the room against my will," said he, "thou shalt go back against thine own. Thy life is ended." He threw her down, dragged her thither by her hair, cut her head off on the block, and hewed her into pieces so that her blood ran on the ground. Then he threw her into the basin with the rest. Now I will fetch myself a second, said the wizard, and again he went down to the house in the shape of a poor man and begged. Then the second daughter bought him a piece of bread. He caught her like the first by simply touching her and carried her away. She did not fare better than her sister. She allowed herself to be led away by her curiosity, opened the door of the bloody chamber, looked in, and had to atone for it with her life on the wizard's return. Then he went and brought the third sister, but she was clever and crafty. When he had given her the keys and the egg and had left her, she first put the egg away with great care, and then she examined the house, and at last she went into the forbidden room. Alas, what did she behold? Both her sisters lay there in the basin, cruelly murdered and cut into pieces. She began to gather the limbs, and together she put them in order, head, body, arms, and legs. And when nothing further was lacking, the limbs began to move and unite themselves together, and both maidens opened their eyes and were alive once more. They rejoiced and kissed and caressed one another. On his arrival, the man had once again demanded the keys and the egg, and as he could perceive no trace of blood on it, he said, "Thou hast stood the test. Thou shalt be my bride." He now had no longer any power over her, and was forced to do whatever she desired. "Oh, very well," said she. "Thou shalt first take a basketful of gold to my father and mother, and carry it thyself on thy back. In the meantime, I will prepare for the wedding." Then she ran to her sister's room she had hidden in a little chamber and said, "The moment has come when I can save you. The wretch shall himself carry you home again, but as soon as you are home, send help to me." She put both of them in a basket and covered them quite over with gold, so nothing of them was to be seen. She called in the wizard and said to him, "Now carry this basket away, but I shall look through my little window and watch to see if thou stops on the way back to stand or rest." The wizard raised the basket on his back and went away with it, but it weighed him down so heavily that the perspiration steamed on his face. Then he sat down and wanted to rest a while, but immediately one of the girls in the basket cried, "I am looking through my little window, and I see that thou art resting. Wilt thou go at once?" He thought his bride was calling to him. He got up on his legs again. Once more he was going to sit down, but instantly she cried, "I am looking through my little window, and I see thou art resting. Wilt thou go on directly?" Whenever he stood still, she cried this, and then he was forced to go onwards until the last, groaning and out of breath, he took the basket with the gold and the two maidens to the parents' house. At home, however, the bride prepared the marriage feast and sent invitations to friends of the wizard. Then she took a skull with grinning teeth and put some ornaments on it and a wreath of flowers, carried it upstairs, and to the garret window. She let it look out from thence. When all was ready, she got into a barrel of honey, and then cut the feather bed open, rolled herself in it until she looked like a wondrous bird, and no one could recognize her. Then she went out to the house, and on her way, she met the wedding guest, who asked, "Oh, Fitchers Bird, how comest thou are here? I come from Fitcher's house quite near." "And what may the young bride be doing?" "From the cellar, the garret she swept all clean, and now from the window she is peeping, I ween." At last she met the bridegroom, who was coming slowly back. He, like the others, asked, "Oh, Fitcher Bird, comest thou here?" "I am from Fitcher house quite near." "And what may the young bride be doing?" "From the cellar garret she is swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween." The bridegroom looked up, saw the decked out skull, and thought it was his bride, and he nodded to her, greeting her kindly. But when he and his guests had all gone into the house, the brothers of the king's men of the bride who had been sent to rescue her arrived. They locked all the doors of the house so that no one might escape, set a fire to it, and the wizard and all his crew were burned. Now, if you were to see me covered in honey and feathers, would you think I too was a bird? Interesting. Interesting indeed. Now, take a deep breath and imagine the next story I have to tell. Welcome back, blood bag. Did you have a nice breath? Did you think nice thoughts? Just imagine yourself with your head laying in my lap and we'll continue. Our second story is the Robber Bride Groom. Let's begin. There was once a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and when she was grown up, he became anxious that she should be well married and taken care of. So he thought, if a decent sort of man comes and asks her marriage, I will give her to him. Soon after, a suitor came forward who seemed very well to do, and as the miller knew nothing to his disadvantage, he promised him to his daughter. But the girl did not seem to love him as a bride should often love her bridegroom. She had no confidence in him. As often as she saw him or thought about him, she felt a chill at her heart. One day he said to her, "You are to be my bride, and yet you have never been to see me." The girl answered, "I do not know where your house is." Then he said, "My house is a long way in the wood." She began to make excuses and said she could not find the way to it. But the bridegroom said, "You must come pay me a visit next Sunday. I have already invited company, and I will strew ashes on the path through the wood so that you'll be sure to find it." When Sunday came, the girl set out on her way. She felt very uneasy without knowing exactly why, and she filled both pockets full of peas and lentils. There were ashes strewn about the path through the wood, but nevertheless, at each step she cast right and left a few peas on the ground. So she went on the whole day until she came to the middle of the wood where it was the darkest. And there stood a lonely house, not pleasant in her eyes, for it was dismal and unhomelike. She walked in, but there was no one there, and the greatest stillness reigned. Suddenly, she heard a voice cry, turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." The girl glanced around and perceived that the voice came from a bird that was hanging in a cage by the wall. And again it cried, turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for evil do things betide." Then the pretty bride went from one room to another through the whole house, but it was quite empty, and no soul to be found in it. At last she reached the cellar, and there sat a very old woman nodding her head. "Can you tell me," said the bride, "if my bridegroom lives here?" "Oh, poor child," answered the old woman. "Do you know what has happened to you? You are in the place of cutthroats. You thought you were a bride and soon to be married, but death will be your spouse. Look here, I have a great kettle of water to set on, and when they once have you in their power, they will cut you into pieces without mercy, cook you and eat you, for they are cannibals. Unless I have pity on you and save you, all is over with you." Then the old woman hid behind her great cask where she could not even be seen. "Be still as a mouse," said she. "Do not move or go away, or else you are lost. At night when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have been waiting a long time for an opportunity." No sooner was it settled than the wicked gang entered the house. They brought another young woman with them, dragging her along, and they were drunk, and they would not listen to her cries and groans. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, one of white wine, one of red, and one of yellow, and then they cut her into pieces. The poor bride, all the while shaking and trembling when she saw what fate the robbers intended for her. One of them noticed a little finger of their victim, a golden ring, and as he could not draw it off easily, he took an axe and chopped it off. The finger jumped away and fell behind the cask on the bride's lap. The robber took up a light and took for it, but he could not find it. Then said one of the others, "Have you looked behind the great cask?" But the old woman cried, "Come to supper and leave off the looking till tomorrow. The fingers cannot run away." Then the robber said to the old woman was right, and they left off searching and sat down to eat. The old woman dropped by sleeping stuff into their wine, so that before long they stretched themselves out on the cellar floor, sleeping and snoring. When the bride heard that, she came from behind the cask and had to make her way among the sleepers lying all about on the ground, and she felt very much afraid lest she might awaken any of them. But by good luck she passed through the door, and the old woman with her. They opened the door and they made haste to leave the house of murderers. The one had carried the ashes from the path, but the peas and lentils had budded and sprung up, and the moon shined down upon them and showed them the way. And they went on through the night till the morning they reached the mill, and the girl relayed to her father all that had happened to her. When the wedding day came, the friends and neighbors assembled, the miller having invited them, and the bridegroom also appeared. And they all were seated at a table, each one of them had to tell a story. But the bride sat still and said nothing, till at last the bridegroom said to her, "Now, my sweetheart, do you know no story? Tell us something." She answered, "I will tell you of my dream. I was going alone through the wood, and I came to a house in which there was no living soul. But all by the wall there was a bird in the cage who cried, 'Turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide.' And then again it said it, sweetheart, the dream is not ended. Then I went through all the rooms, and they were empty, and it was so lonely and wretched. At last I went down to the cellar, and there sat an old woman nodding her head. I asked her if my bridegroom lived in the house, and she answered, 'Ah, poor child, you have come to the place of cutthroats. Your bridegroom does live here, but he will kill you and cut you into pieces, and then cook you and eat you.' Sweetheart, the dream has not ended. The old woman hid me in a great cask, and no sooner had she done so than the robbers came home, dragging with them a young woman, and they gave her drink with wine thrice red, white, yellow. Sweetheart, that dream is not ended. And then they killed her. They cut her into pieces. Sweetheart, my dream is not yet ended. And the robbers saw a gold ring on the finger of the young woman, and as it is difficult to get off, he took an axe and chopped off the finger, which jumped upwards and then fell behind a great cask onto my lap. And here is the finger with the ring." At these words, she drew forth and showed it to the company. The robber, who during the story had grown deadly white, sprang up and would have escaped, but the folks held him fast and delivered him to justice, and he and his whole gang were there, ended for their evil deeds, commended and executed. Bet that'll teach you. I bet that will teach you. Were you having hungry thoughts? Were you trying to nibble at my fingies? I don't think so. Now rest well, and let me find you a third tale. Welcome back, my sweet bloodbag. Now for a story you probably know much better. It's time for Little Red Riding Hood. Oh, a connecting theme, you say? I guess the connecting theme is either dismemberment or murder? Or cannibalism? Something? Don't ask me, don't ask me. It's, time for Little Red Riding Hood. Breathe in and out. There was once a sweet little maid, much beloved by everybody, but most of all by her grandmother, who never knew how to make enough of her. Once she sent her a little red riding hood of velvet, and as is very becoming of her, she never wore anything else. People called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Riding Hood, here is some cakes and a flask of wine for you to take to your grandmother. She is weak and ill, and they will do her good. Make haste and start before it grows hot, and walk properly and nicely, and don't run, or you might fall and break the flask of wine, and there will be none left for grandmother. And when you go up to her room, don't forget to say good morning, instead of starting about, you. I will be sure to take care," said Little Red Riding Hood to her mother, and gave her a hand upon it. Now the grandmother lived away in the wood, half an hour's walk from the village, and the Little Red Riding Hood had reached into the wood. She met a wolf. As she did not know what a bad sort of animal he was. She did not feel frightened at all. "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood," said he. "Thank you kindly, Wolf," answered she. "Where are you going so early, Little Red Riding Hood?" "To my grandmother's." "What are you carrying under your apron?" "Cakes and wine. We baked yesterday, and my grandmother's very weak and ill, so they will do her good, and it will strengthen her." "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" "A quarter of an hour's walk from here. Her house stands beneath a 3 oaks tree. You may know it by its hazel bushes," said Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself, "That tender young thing would be a delicious morsel and would taste better than the old one. I must manage somehow to get both of them." Then he walked by Little Red Riding Hood a little while and said, "Little Red Riding Hood, just look at those pretty flowers that are growing all around you. I don't think you're listening to the song of the birds. You are posting along just as if you were going to school, and it is so delightful out here in the wood." Little Red Riding Hood glanced all around her, and when she saw the sunbeams darting here and there through the trees and the lovely flowers everywhere, she thought to herself, "If I were to take a fresh nosegay to my grandmother, she'd be very pleased. And it is so early in the day that I shall reach her in plenty of time." And so she ran about the wood looking for flowers. And as she picked one, she saw an even prettier one and ran still a little bit more off. And so she went further and further into the wood. But the wolf went straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" cried the grandmother. "Little Red Riding Hood," he answered. "I have brought you some cake and wine. Please open the door." "Lift the hatch," cried the grandmother. "I am too feeble to get up." So the wolf lifted the hatch, and the door flew open, and he fell onto the grandmother and ate her up without saying one word. Then he drew on her clothes, put on her cap, lay down in her bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Riding Hood was all this time running about among the flowers, and when she had gathered as many as she could hold, she remembered her grandmother and set off to go to her. She was surprised to find the door standing open, and when she came inside, she felt very strange, and thought to herself, "Oh dear, how uncomfortable I feel, and I was so glad this morning when I got to my grandmother." And when she said, "Good morning," there was no answer. Then she went up to the bed and drew back the curtains, and there lay grandmother with her cap pulled over her eyes, so that she looked very odd. "Oh, grandmother, what large ears you have, the better to hear with. Oh, grandmother, what great eyes you have, the better to see with. Oh, grandmother, what large hands you have. The better to take hold of you with. But grandmother, what a terrible large mouth you have. The better to devour you. And no sooner had the wolf said it than he made bound from the bed and swallowed up Little Red Riding Hood. Then the wolf, having satisfied his hunger, lay down in the bed and went to sleep and began to snore loudly. The huntsman heard him as he was passing by the house and thought, "How the old woman snores, I had better to see if there's anything the matter with her." Then he went into the room and walked up to the bed and saw the wolf lying there. "At last I found you, you old sinner," said he. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." And he made up his mind that the wolf had swallowed the grandmother whole and that she might be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of shears and began to slit up the wolf's body. When he made a few snips, Little Red Riding Hood appeared, and after a few more snips, she jumped out and cried, "Oh dear, how frightened I have been! It is so dark inside the wolf." And then came old grandmother, still living and breathing. But Little Red Riding Hood went quickly and fetched some large stones which he filled into the wolf's body, so that when he wake up, he would go rush away. The stones were so heavy, it would sink down and he would fall dead. They were all very pleased. The huntsman took off the wolf's skin and carried it home. The grandmother ate the cakes and drank the wine and held her head up high again. And Little Red Riding Hood said to herself that she'd never more stray about in the wood alone, would mind what her mother told her. It must also be related to how a few days afterward, when Little Red Riding Hood was again taking cakes to her grandmother, another wolf spoke to her and wanted to tempt her to leave the path. But she was on her guard and went straight on her way and told her grandmother how the wolf had met her and wished her a good day, but it had looked so wicked about the eyes that she had thought if it had not been on the high road, he would have definitely devoured her. "Come in," said the grandmother. "We will shut the door so that he may not get in." Soon after, the wolf came a-knocking at the door and calling out, "Open the door, grandmother. I'm Little Red Riding Hood bringing you cakes." But they remained still and did not open the door. After the wolf slunk by the house and got up last up upon the roof to wait until Little Red Riding Hood should return home in the evening, then he meant to spring down upon her and devour her into the darkness. But grandmother discovered his plot. Now there stood before a house a great stone trough, and grandmother said to the child, "Little Red Riding Hood, I was boiling sausages yesterday, so take the bucket and carry the water the way they were boiled in, and pour it in the trough." And Little Red Riding Hood did so until the great trough was quite full, and when the smell of the sausages reached the nose of the wolf, he snuffed it up, looked around, stretched his neck out so far that he lost balance and began to slip. And he slipped down off the roof, straight into the great trough, and was drowned. Then Little Red Riding Hood went cheerfully home and came to no harm. Did you know there was two wolves? A two-wolf story? Quite interesting indeed. Maybe people in fairy tales shouldn't live in the woods. Seems awfully dangerous. But don't worry, Bloodbag. You'll sleep well. I'll never let any harm befall you. Well, almost any harm at least. You did offer me some of your blood after all, and you better pay up, okay? Good night.